Welcome to Inside Economics. I'm Mark Zandi, the chief economist of Moody's Analytics, and I'm joined today by my two colleagues, my trusted colleagues, Ryan Sweet. Ryan is the head of real-time economics. Ryan, good to see you. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you, Mark?
Yeah. Are you ever not doing well, Ryan? I mean,
No,
that's like your standard. I'm fine. You're good.
everything's great.
Everything's great.
Except for,
Good.
I mean, my two youngest kids are home today.
Why?
School was closed.
Unexpectedly, or?
They have like a teacher in service day. These things pop up from time to time, and then
Right.
we're scrambling with two screaming little children. So
Right. Well, yeah. You're made for that stuff, Ryan.
I try.
Yeah, I know. And I got Cris Derides, deputy chief economist. Hi, Cris.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
What happened to your red shirt? Your Ferrari shirt.
I'm mixing it up.
I can't really
It's
tell.
green.
Is that like a pullover, or what are you wearing today? Like a green?
It's it's got this hood here.
He's a hoodie. He's got a hoodie.
It's hoodie.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah.
Very good. And how was your week, Cris?
So far so good. Well, I guess it's almost over here. So
yeah, it's almost over. Hey, I was in Washington again this week, and I'll have to report that I spent a day there. Traffic is back to normal. I can't tell the difference.
Really?
No.
Wow.
Remember I was there, I don't know, back in July or something, June, July, and it felt really quiet, dead to me.
Ghost town. Yeah.
Not this time. It was happening. And last night, I went to get my hair cut. I have like 3 hairs on my head. So I got the 3 hairs cut. So I get my hair cut in Westchester. That's where our office is here out in suburban Philly. And I'll have to tell you, traffic was horrendous. It was horrendous at 5:30.
Do they still have that street closed down for all the restaurants?
No.
Oh, maybe that was.
That's open back up.
Let's back up.
Yep.
Oh yeah, no, that was open. That was that was the main thoroughfare was open. Yeah. So, I just feels like things are coming back to life. Yeah. But
Mobility's up, right? In our back to normal index.
Yep. The mobility's up. And we have a guest today, Emilie Mazzacurati. Emilie, good to see you. How are you?
Hi, Mark. I am good, thanks. How are you?
I'm always good. I'm always good, as you can tell. So, Emilie, you're speaking to us from Paris.
I am. So it's very much the end of the day here. Week is almost over.
So that picture I see behind you, that's just a screen. That's not real life then.
I always have my Berkeley, California background with me, yes.
I was going to say, that looks like California. That does not
The
look
sun
like
is always shining behind me.
I was going to say, that does not look like Paris on November 12th, 2021. Yeah,
You're
it's probably
correct.
getting pretty dark. Yeah.
Foggy and cold.
Yeah. Well, Emilie, we're very happy to have you here on Inside Economics talking about climate change. That's going to be the big topic for today's discussion. Good timing, right? COP26, didn't that end today? I believe.
You can say that. It's supposed to end in a couple of hours, the negotiations. Typically they run late, but yeah, I was just in Glasgow, so maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
Oh, great. You were there. Okay. So we're going to come back to you and really dive into that, really try to get a sense of what came out of that confab, but it's good to have you. Tell us about yourself, Emilie. You joined Moody's when Moody's bought 427, your company, a Berkeley-based company. By the way, I do want to tell everyone, because I want to speak a little French, I want you to tell me what you think of this. You got a master's of political science from, here you go, ready? Institut d'études politiques de Paris. How about that? Is that good?
Beautiful. That was awesome.
I can't do that again, but and then you got a master's of public policy at UC Berkeley, which is a great place to get a degree in public policy. That is a wonderful university. Did you ever have Christy Romer? Did you ever have her as a course? Economist, she was CEA chair under Obama, Council of Economic Advisors. Did you have her? No? What about Robert Reich?
Doesn't ring a bell. Yes.
You had Robert Reich? Oh, you did?
Did overlap with Robert Reich, yeah.
And what do you think of Dr. Reich? We're going to get to know your politics right away, right now. we can nail you.
Cards on the table.
I read Into the Cabinet. Is that the name of his book? The summer before I went to, I flew to the US and ended up making my life here, and loved that book. And I enjoyed the class too. It was
Yeah, he's
very
a
much
good guy.
about politics. The rest of the program was very analytical, economics and statistics, which was great and what I was coming for. But I did enjoy the political angle of what Robert Reich was bringing.
Yeah, he's a really good guy. I run across him once a year or so, and it's just always a pleasure to listen to him. He's very, very articulate, certainly on issues of income and wealth inequality. I mean, that's really he's very good on that. Well, that's great. And I have a link to UC Berkeley. I'm on the board of advisors for the Turner Real Estate Center, so they have a really good set of researchers on Californian real estate, obviously, key.
No
Uh,
issue there whatsoever.
yeah, so I'm on the advisory board there, which lets me link into Berkeley. I wasn't able to go out to Berkeley this year for that though, but anyway, it's great to have you. So tell us your backstory, Emilie. Tell us about 427, how you started that. Wait, oh, and I should ask, what does 427 mean anyway? I mean, I'm sure there's a meaning to that.
There is a meaning. So I'm gonna backtrack even more before 427.
Yeah.
Did my master's public policy in Berkeley and fell in love with cap and trade while I was doing my master's, because why not, right? So cap and trade is using markets to reduce carbon emissions by letting the market set the price of where is it most efficient to reduce carbon emissions. And I worked on carbon markets, climate policy for a number of years after that, for a company that was specialized on forecasting supply and demand for carbon trading instruments. So in Europe, in parts of the US, there were carbon markets. And I was helping translate policy, regulatory, and political developments into signals for the markets. Was the cap and trade bill going to pass, and what might it look like? What was going to be the price on that market? What did that then mean for oil and gas sector, utilities, which was good fun for a while until the cap and trade bill in Congress went to hell. That was back in 2010. April 24th, if you want to know when exactly that happened. And about the same, right, yeah, still hurting from it. And around the same time, the company that I worked for was acquired, and I decided it was time to move on, both from the company that I worked with, but what I was working on, because clearly the US was not committed to climate policy. And again, we're talking 11 years ago. And there was a lot of science that was starting to come out around the fact that we had a lot of physical impacts that we were going to experience regardless, that climate change was locked in to a certain extent because we had already put so much emissions in the atmosphere. And so that was the impetus to create 427. I wanted to work on adaptation and the physical climate risk and help businesses, investors, corporates understand what the science was saying and what data was available for them to embed into decisions and risk management. And so long story short, the name 427 is a reference to California's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for 2020. So it's 427 million tons of carbon dioxide, which California was going to more than meet, be well below in terms of emissions, except for the wildfires, which put our emissions through the roof again. So physical risk caught up with, with transition risk. So that was the transition, going from doing political policy analysis to helping translate science for my clients, who I knew well, and I knew what data they needed, but much more focused on physical risk.
So you started 427 in about a decade ago then?
In 2012, yes.
2012, okay. And you grew it into a
aha
good size.
moment, yeah, the aha moment was actually being in New York right before Hurricane Sandy, and then seeing the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy and seeing the New York Stock Exchange close for 3 days. It's like, those people are so smart and they have so much money. How could they not know that it was going to happen? Something's missing here, right?
You're mistaken that they're actually correlated things. Just saying. No, sorry.
I was wondering where you were going with that for a minute.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. And then you sold 427 to Moody's. When was it now? 2 years ago or so?
Yeah, 2019. So then there was a
2019.
lot of hard work and
Yep.
people giving us weird looks. Why do you think I should care about climate data? And then the world started caring about climate data, and including a strong interest from Moody's, both from the credit ratings agency part and
Yeah, for
Moody's
sure.
Analytics. And so sold and have been working on really integrating climate across everything that we do over the past couple of years now.
Right. You, as you said, you're now running you're the global head of climate risk solutions for the entire Moody's organization. And there's a lot of moving parts here that are all evolving very quickly, and you're managing that evolution.
Lots of moving parts, especially with the recent acquisition of RMS, the cat modeling firm, which is adding a ton of capabilities and really sophisticated models on extreme weather events and the financial and economic impacts of those events. So a lot of fun work ahead.
Yeah, it's great to have you. This is, obviously very important for the initiative for Moody's, but obviously this is going to be key to driving lots of things going forward. Can I ask before we move on about your name, Mazzacurati? Is that a French name?
That is not a French name. My grandfather was Italian.
Ah, okay.
So,
Cris knew that. Did you know that, Cris?
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Oh, for sure. So how would you say Mazzacurati? Am I saying it right?
What I love is when people ask me in the US how to say Mazzacurati in French. There's no good answer to that.
That's a great
in
one.
Italian, it would be Mazzacurati.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. How do you answer that when they say, how do I say it in French?
I say the French can't say it either.
Yeah, you're right. That's funny. Je ne sais pas. I don't know.
Exactly. They don't know.
Yeah. All right. Very good. Well, it's so good to have you. Well, before you said you laid out a lot of things that we want to dive into more deeply in just a few minutes. But as per tradition on Inside Economics, we start with the economic data and statistics, or any statistics. I know you might have some climate statistics you might want to play this game with. We have a game here where we state a statistic and we'll let the other folks try to figure that statistic out. I'll have to say I'm probably the best at this game, Emilie. No, only kidding. See, Ryan's very quiet. He's very humble.
He's second best.
I'm maybe. No, I think Ryan is the top dog here.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, given that he's the top dog, hey, Ryan, what's your statistic of the week?
Well, we have to go with something inflation related because that's top of mind.
Okay,
so I'm going to go with, that's a hint, 51%.
51%. That's not like
energy.
Year.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Guess.
Cris, do you have a guess already?
I was thinking year-over-year energy, some gasoline. No?
Nope. Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Mark.
Because you're saying that, Cris, because energy prices saw the biggest increase. Everything rose. Inflation rose across the board, but most for gasoline energy prices. So you thought maybe that was 51%. And Ryan, that's not the answer.
No, think outside the CPI report. It's tied to
outside.
inflation.
Okay.
51% highest on record.
Okay. Does this go back to the NFIB survey, the Small Business Survey?
See it? Mark's.
Okay.
Mark's
National
there.
Federation of Independent Business. Is that the percent of respondents that are raising prices?
Very close. Plan
to raise prices.
Mm-hmm. So
I think that's a cowbell.
Impressive.
I think that's a cowbell, right?
Well, no, wait. He didn't say yes. He just kind of shaking his head.
Yeah.
Huh?
No, you're right.
Well, come on. We need some excitement.
Cowbell. Come on.
Cowbell. Bring out the cowbell.
Yeah, no, impressive. Oh,
there you go.
We got a cowbell.
We have
Emilie,
a cowbell.
only when I get it right, though, Emilie. Not these other guys.
Yeah.
Only when I get it right.
That's
so, okay. All right. So you're saying in the National Federation of Independent Business Small Business Survey, monthly survey, 51% of respondents said that they plan to raise prices, and you're saying that is the highest on record?
Yeah, the next highest was back in 2008 when we had that big spike in oil prices. But other than that, this thing is by far and away the highest on record. And the survey goes back to the early 1980s.
Early 1980s, so in that high inflationary period.
Exactly.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, Ryan. What do you make of the CPI? Give us a sense of that was a good number, but the marquee statistic last week was the release of the consumer price inflation for the United States for October, and it's tell us about that and how you interpret what the report is saying.
So why I picked the 51% is that it actually does a pretty good job in leading. It's a good leading indicator for core inflation, and it suggests that we haven't peaked on a year-over-year basis. We'll likely peak 6% early next year. But the October CPI, like you mentioned before, everything rose. I mean, it was across the board. It wasn't just, we talked about before, like the reopening components, lodging away from home, rental car prices, sporting events, things like that, more likely a one-time event. It's starting to broaden out. I mean, it's really across the board that you're starting to see inflationary pressures. So if you strip out used and new car prices, the reopening effect, energy, the CPI was still up 0.4% month over month, which is an acceleration from what we saw over the last few months.
Okay. So let me ask you this. And Cris, I'm going to ask you the same question. What's behind this surge in inflation? Fundamentally, what's going on here?
Demand is just really strong across the board. It's like a release of pent-up demand for consumer services, goods. It's all really
disagree. Totally right. Disagree. Yeah.
See what Cris says.
I mean, demand.
I'd say the opposite. Lack of supply.
Lack of supply. It's not demand. Yeah, Cris, what do you say? I don't want to listen to Ryan anymore. Cris.
Lack of supply, for sure. Yeah, demand is bad. Certainly, you can't. If demand was still low, you wouldn't have it. But right now, why we're seeing the surges is the supply side for certain, right? Energy, all the goods, supply chain effects, ports, everything is
so
backed
you're
up.
Buying into the cost push inflation.
It's shortages. I mean, I can't buy a car. There's 75,000 cars on a dealer lot because they can't produce cars because of a chip shortage, because Malaysian chip plants shut down because of Delta. I mean, you're right. Demand, if demand was weak, you wouldn't see inflation. And demand for goods in particular has been strong. For services, it's still below pre-pandemic levels by orders of magnitude. So,
but it's picking up.
And the other thing I'd point out is demand growth really slowed because of Delta. GDP growth, obviously that's more than just demand, but a big part of it's demand consumption. That was much weaker in the third quarter because of Delta. No?
I mean, it's
Am I convincing you? No?
No, not at all. I mean, it's almost like a combination. I think there's some supply issues still going on that's contributing to it. But if you look, maybe you can explain to me how supply chain issues are causing sporting admission prices to go up 8% month over month.
I'll tell you. Here's how I would answer that question. The answer to that question is the Delta wave of the pandemic, because the Delta wave of the pandemic did significant damage to global supply chains and to the labor markets. So on the supply chain side, and because Delta was particularly hard on Asia, Southeast Asia, where all the supply chains begin. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we see shortages for vehicles and furniture and, you name the product. And it's demand destruction. They can't sell because there's no supply, and shortages and higher prices. And then, of course, it scrambled the labor market. More people got sick, couldn't go to work, took care of sick people, fearful of getting sick. So you had all these open positions, particularly in the industry you just articulated, recreational activities, leisure and hospitality, personal services. So that's where you're seeing the wage growth. That's where the wage growth has been strongest, because people just haven't been going back to work, and because of the Delta wave, and the businesses in those industries are passing that along to consumers. So, in my mind, the fundamental reason for the acceleration in inflation to the degree that we've observed, is the Delta wave. It's a supply shock. It nailed demand, it hurt demand, and it's caused inflationary pressures to develop. A very classic kind of supply shock.
I was on board with that whole argument for the last several months, but now in October, you're starting to see signs that it's not just supply, it's also demand pull.
No.
Look at
Where?
owner's equivalent rent. I mean, rents
Oh,
are
no,
starting to pick up.
rent growth. That's supply and demand, but actually
Correct.
it's more supply than demand. But we can come back to that. But what else? I mean, other than rent growth, because I agree, rent growth is going to accelerate.
No, I mean, everything's going to start to decelerate soon.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the pandemic didn't repeal the law of demand. I mean, demand's going to start to weaken in response to these higher prices.
So is your argument inventory build on the part of businesses? Is that the demand you're citing? That the extra or the accelerated demand is
No, inventories
folks
are
wanting
still-
to?
Yeah, inventories are really, really lean. Like, you can't get a car, right? But also, if you look at container traffic going through the port of Long Beach, it's significantly higher than it was in 2019. So that's, that's not necessarily a supply issue. They just can't process at the amount of demand there is for these containers.
Look,
That's a supply
yeah.
issue.
Look. Here, all it's like looking at the stars and trying to come up with a unified theory of what's going on with the stars. And the best explanation, and maybe it's wrong, I don't know, but it's the best explanation for what's going on here is the Delta wave. It scrambled supply chains. It scrambled labor markets. It's also affected the composition of demand, which is also important, right? Because it jacked up the demand for stuff, vehicles and furniture and everything I got on my back deck out here, and nailed demand for services. A total demand, total consumer spending, that's still not even quite back to where you would have thought it would be if there was no pandemic. Overall demand.
Right.
Overall
composition. Right.
So the composition is, but it's about the Delta wave, and but this is really important, right? Because this gives you a sense of where inflation is headed. If you buy into my theory of inflation, my looking into the stars theory of inflation, that says, okay, the Delta wave is now fading, assuming the pandemic continues to fade. Then the worst of the inflationary pressures are at hand. Maybe it lasts another month or two. I don't know, because it takes a while to unscramble things. But by early next year, we should see definitive signs of inflation moderating. If my theory is right.
I agree with you. Yeah, I agree.
Oh, you
with you
do?
on that. Yeah.
Okay.
I think we just disagree. I think I would argue that you're starting to see more demand pull inflation, but it's temporary. It's people aren't going to. There's a lot of pent up demand for restaurants and going to sporting events. That we'll get through that. We'll work through that pretty quickly.
Yeah. Emilie, you want to settle this?
No, but I'll throw in the statistics if you want to try to get.
Yeah. Far away. Yeah. Are you
All
changing
right.
subjects on us though?
I am changing subject. I'm getting a little closer to my heart. Not that I don't care about inflation.
Okay. Can I ask before we go to if you're going to change subjects, because it might be I'm guessing you're going to go to climate change, right? On your statistic.
That's a wild guess, but you're spot on.
Okay, so why don't you wait, because that's a good
Okay.
segue into our conversation around climate issues, and let's just finish this conversation around inflation and the statistics. So I'm going to turn to Cris next. Cris,
All right.
do you have an inflation statistic?
Yes.
Okay.
All things inflation.
Is it support my view or Ryan's view?
It supports. It actually supports Emilie's view.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
It's got a
hint
climate
here.
change factor in it. That's
Oh,
why I
it
chose
does. Okay,
Oh,
far,
yeah,
okay. Go
yeah.
ahead. Go ahead. Far away.
So Ryan's complained that I make these too easy. So this one I dug into the bowels. So you get what you ask for, Ryan. 2.1 and 5.6%.
All right. Year over year or month over month?
Both. One is month over month. One is year over year.
Is it
2.1.
tied to climate change?
Well, I'm going to tie it to climate change.
Oh,
It's an inflation.
Somehow
So
it's
those are
gotta
two
re-
inflation
So,
numbers.
energy prices.
Yeah, it's got
No, not energy. Not energy.
Is it PPI or CPI?
CPI.
CPI.
And it is the price for, you're talking about the change in the price for some good or
Something.
service. Right, Chris?
Yes. Yes, that's
You're
right.
not allowed to take a drink in the middle of your question. So
Okay. All right.
It's
and you were drinking Wawa coffee. Is that
That was
Wawa?
a hint, by the way. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, that was a hint.
are you, and you're looking at
Oh, that's why you
coffee,
drink a drink. Okay.
coffee
Oh,
prices?
coffee. Yeah.
Yes, roasted coffee up 2.1% in 1 month.
He picked that
Oh,
because
wow.
he's complaining that,
Wow.
his costs are
5
going up.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. Inflation's personal. That's one.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's part of it. But the reasons why coffee prices have gone up are twofold. One is supply chain effects, right? The other is climate change related. Brazil had a
Oh,
terrible season of a drought and a flood,
yeah.
or drought and frost. And so they've cut production. And then Vietnam, who's the second biggest producer of coffee, has supply chain issues, right? So you got everything.
Yeah, that's a good one. So coffee prices were up 2.1% October over September, and they were up 5 point something
6,
over the year.
5.6,
5.6%.
yeah. And it's going to get worse, actually, because those are the consumer prices, but the producer prices, the commodity price is up 100%.
Right.
It just accelerated today, actually. We're up substantially.
And that's
Interesting.
just the trend because coffee is one of those crops that are very much at threat from changing
Exactly.
precipitation and weather patterns and pests and drought and you name it, right?
Exactly.
Right.
It's
That
all
was a good
related.
one.
Did I
It's
steal,
all
did I
related.
steal your punching line?
No,
Yeah,
no,
that was
it's all
really
good.
good.
That was
I can
good.
see you gave that some thought. That was really good. That was a really good one.
On my way to
Um,
Wawa. Yeah.
okay, I got another inflation, the CPI inflation one. This one's, this might be a little hard, so you feel free to quiz me. 3.1%, and it's two different statistics that are 3.1%. And now that I just said that, I forgot
Oh,
what one of the statistics are. Hold on one second. Oh,
I,
okay. Now I remember. Go ahead. What's
I know one of the.
3.1%?
I know a 3.1%. I don't know if it's yours, but that's
Oh, really? Okay, go ahead.
owner's equivalent rent
Was that
is
up 3.1%?
3.1 year
Year,
over year.
year over year.
Oh, okay. So there's 3.1% in the report. Oh, and this is an important, going back to Ryan's point. Ryan, was I too hard on you
No,
when
you're
I,
never too hard on
no,
me.
we're good. Okay. You're still my friend.
Yeah,
Okay. All right. Okay. So let's go back to rent growth and the acceleration there. Did you want to, Cris, talk about that? What's going on with rent growth?
So rent growth also, 2 points, I have note here, 2.7% year over year, right? So both were up 0.4% month
I'm
over
sorry.
month.
3.1 was what then? Owner's
3.1 was
equivalent?
owner's equivalent rent.
Oh, I see. And then
Rents
rent
are 2.7. So
2.7. Owner's equivalent is rent of homes. The equivalent, how the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, measures the cost of owning a home is through the implicit rent that the homeowner would pay, and that's called homeowner's equivalent rent, and that was up 3.1% year
correct.
over year. And if you rent your home, that was up 2.7% year
Right.
over
Rent
year.
to a tenant.
Okay.
That's
Right.
2.7.
Exactly.
That's right. So anyway, pretty close to each other. Up. Both were up 0.4% in the month, though, right? So that's a healthy gain. That's accelerating. Um, those year over years are still, though, not at the level that we had prior to the pandemic, right? So you see things increasing here, and they will continue to increase in terms of the rate of change, but because prices have been going up, but it hasn't fully caught up. So I see this
Okay.
certainly as a tailwind going forward.
Yeah, and on this, I would argue. I mean, it's always demand and supply when it comes to price, but
Mhm.
when we're talking about rent growth,
Did you want to say that again? It's always demand
yeah.
and supply. Okay, I just want to
Well,
point that out.
I did say that. I did say that. I mean, we wouldn't have these price increases if demand was weak. That's for sure. Yeah, but
Sure.
but even on the rent growth, that's more. I would consider that to be more a supply side issue than a demand side issue. That the supply of new housing, both for rent and for sale, has been very constrained post financial crisis for more than a decade since the housing bust. We just have not been putting up enough homes to meet even the weak demand that existed early on in the period after the financial crisis. And so vacancy rates have continued to decline. And I think vacancy rates across the housing stock for rent and for sale together is pretty close to an all-time low. And I consider that a supply side issue.
Mhm.
Do you, Cris?
Yeah, certainly,
They're the- Yeah,
certainly.
right.
And
Now,
demand factors in there too, Ryan. So
yeah,
we
it
have
does,
to.
absolutely. Yeah. And it may be
Yeah,
because
but
of the
there's only
pandemic.
so
And
much
here the case,
housing you can consume, right? So it is a supply issue.
yeah, yeah. There's a demand component in the sense that with the pandemic winding down, I think you've seen households form, right? A lot of people millennials doubled up when the pandemic was raging. They went back to their parents' home, and now they're striking out and they rent whatever, generally, as opposed to buy. So you have seen some pickup in demand, but it's bumping up against very, very limited supply, and you get these rent increases
Yep.
and price increases. Okay.
So you had another 3.1?
I do. I've got two more actually. I've got two more. They're
Well, I know the
they're
other one.
difficult. They're difficult, but they're, I think, instructive. I picked them for reasons of instruction.
You've got it, Ryan. You got one.
I think I got one.
Oh, what's that?
Rental car prices, they were up 3.1%.
No, these
the
are
month?
that's a good one though. But I'll give you. So going back to what Cris said a little bit ago about, we're just catching back up to, inflation's pre-pandemic. So there was a period, a year ago when prices were getting cut or inflation was very low. So to some degree, what economists call a base effect is influencing these numbers, right? So
Mhm.
is that as a hint, what do you think 3.1% is?
Oh, is it the change in the CPI from 2 years ago?
Exactly. Core CPI,
Core CPI.
consumer price inflation, ex food and energy, which economists focus on because that's the best predictor of future inflation. That is up 3.1% on an annualized basis over the past 2 years. So take October this year, the bad number, compared to October of 2019, calculate the average annual growth, and it's 3.1%. Right. And in my mind,
Still high.
Still high. But in my mind, that's reality. That's where inflation
Okay,
actually
sure.
is.
Sure.
Right. I don't know. Ryan, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would
statement?
agree with that.
Okay. So 3.1 in target CPI inflation, where the Fed wants it, I'd say is as high as 2.5%.
Mhm.
Right.
Correct.
So we're 60.6 percentage points, 60 basis points off. Even in this hair on fire, inflation's high, I'd say 3.1. So that's my 3.1. I'll give you, there's one more 3.1. You'll never get this. Should I
give us
tell
a
you what
hint?
it is?
Just give us a hint. Is it
No,
still
here,
this-
I'll give you a hint. I'll give you a hint. It comes from the Cleveland Fed. Ryan might get this.
Oh, the median or trim?
Oh, you got it. It's
Median.
the median.
Yeah,
The
median.
median inflation rate. So this is kind of cool. Cleveland Fed has a website. They publish different measures of inflation. That's one of the things Cleveland Fed focuses on is inflation. You total up all the goods and services, look at across all the products and services, and I don't know how many they track, Ryan. Do you know the BLS? How many do they release?
Not off the top of my head.
Lots,
it's a lot.
hundreds.
A lot, yeah.
Then they calculate the growth in prices over the past year, and they look at the price of the product or services that's in the middle of that distribution, the median.
Mhm.
And the median CPI increase is
3.1.
3.1%, which also gives me confidence that we're going to go back in here pretty quickly.
So if you were in Powell's shoes, would you start raising interest rates sooner?
Absolutely not.
And
What I would do,
shocked.
no, because you got to. This is a supply shock that has not affected inflation expectations. Therefore, I should be focused on the growth aspect of the supply shock. I should be thinking about how do I get this economy back to full employment. If inflation expectations started to rise, I'm with you. Here's one thing I'll say though, in that regard, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
But I'm
and if
with
I'm
you.
wrong, to guard against that possibility, I would start, if I were him, guiding the market to their expectations for a rate increase sooner than the market has been expecting now. So right now the market, or at least before the CPI report, the market was expecting 225 basis point increases in the federal funds rate beginning sometime this time next year. Is that the same, Ryan? Do you know?
No, it's up to 3 now.
It's up to 3. So that's exactly what I would do, and I would ratify that if I were him. I say, yeah, that sounds about right to me. Maybe even 4, kind of bring it forward, a little bit.
No,
That's
they
what
gotta
I
be
would.
patient.
Yeah.
He can't pull the trigger too soon.
Well, do you agree with that? Well,
Yeah, I was saying I was shocked because you have a tendency to lean a little bit more hawkish.
Oh, I do?
But yeah, don't
I
you
didn't
agree,
realize
Chris?
that. I'm a
over the
hawk.
years.
Yeah,
Really?
yeah.
Oh.
Yeah,
You
usually
like-
we're a little bit more
I mean,
hawkish.
relative to you guys are flaming doves,
Flaming doves.
flaming doves.
We got our title.
Oh, we got our title. Now we got to find Emilie. We'll fill you in on what that means a little later. But we have to come up with a pithy title. Flaming doves. That's a good one.
Yep.
All right. Okay, we got to move on. Emilie, what's your statistic?
All right. It is 7%.
7%, and it's related to climate change.
Is it something that
Oh,
came
I
out
think
recently?
I know.
Or?
I'm gonna guess. I'm gonna guess. Get the cowbell out, Ryan.
There's no way you're getting this one.
On the first shot. I will see it.
7% of the world's population is at a high risk of some type of physical event.
You're way below. We have like
Way
30% of the population at risk of
Oh
flood.
my gosh.
So
Really?
no. I'm gonna guide you a little closer. It's more related to energy and it's
Okay.
it's an economic statistic.
Okay, 7% of electricity production comes from wind. No?
That I wish I
Maybe.
had that number at the top of my finger.
All right.
So
She's thinking
you're
that could be
getting
right,
closer.
but that's not what I'm
Yeah.
thinking.
Is this a growth rate?
May or may not be right.
Is it a growth rate?
It's no, it's a percent of it's more of a stable thing. But look
Okay.
on the dark side is my hint here.
Look on the dark side. Oh my goodness. I can feel that Emilie goes dark very quickly. That's what. Ryan, you got any ideas here? Any clues? Can you give us another clue without giving it away, Emilie? Or should we give up?
Sure.
Should we say
No,
uncle?
no. Okay.
Is it a
I'll give
global
you.
or regional
I'll get you.
statistic?
It's global. It's a global statistic, and it
Okay.
has to do with subsidies. Okay, I almost gave it away, but not completely.
Oh, subsidies. Is that the total fiscal subsidy provided by governments for climate risk mitigation? No.
Or for
I
fossil
wish.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
it's fossil
Jeez.
fuel.
Oh,
Or
Chris.
fossil fuel?
Chris got it. Yeah. So
What is
that's
it?
the global total fossil fuel subsidies per the IMF for 2020. So that's $5.9 trillion globally. And in the US, I believe the number is 20 billion a year. So we're, behind China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran in terms of how much money we put into fossil fuels. But it's just like, how much do we want to shoot ourselves in the foot
My gosh.
when it comes to climate change?
7% of what? Of GDP or 7% of?
Yeah, of global GDP.
That is
Yeah.
that's an
That's huge.
amazing statistic. Yeah. Wow. And is it going down or do you know? Is it changed? much?
I don't, not in a meaningful fashion, certainly not in the US.
That's
Probably
outrageous.
going up, if anything. So if your next question is, how are we doing with the climate negotiation at COP?
Yeah,
you'll-
that would be
you'll
my
know-
next question.
you'll know
Let's
what
move
the
into the big
answer,
topic. How are
right?
we doing?
Well, think about it, right? So there's so much at stake for the fossil fuel industry, not just the subsidies, but also their ability to function and sell. There are more representatives from the fossil fuel industry than government at COP right now. Now, granted, those representatives from the fossil fuel industry are not in the room drafting the language from the final agreement themselves, but that gives you a flavor for what's going on. So the negotiations are making progress. We're expecting at time of recording, they're supposed to finish up in about an hour and a half. I don't think that's going to happen. They usually stop the clock, as we say, and run long over the weekend. They're supposed to agree on how we're going to reach the Paris Agreement target. So how we're going to reduce emissions enough that we can keep global warming to well below 2 degrees is the Paris language. Preferably to 1.5 Celsius degrees. So that's the global temperature increase. And there is something about reducing fossil fuel and reducing subsidies, but I'm not sure it's going to be quite as biting as we need to really reduce emissions.
You said you were
globally.
there. You attended COP26?
sideshow, not part of the negotiations, but there's a lot of people who get together around the negotiation on the fringes, the off festival, if you want. Lots of conferences where we talk about the future of the world, how the financial markets are integrating climate risk, and what are the big topics. So it's also a big event for people who care about climate, even if we're not in the room arguing over where the comma should go in that sentence.
So let me ask, coming out of that, do you feel more hopeful or not regarding the world's commitment to addressing this issue?
Oh, it's always a hard question. I'm hopeful with some of the improvements and momentum that's been created around this specific year's COP. So Mark Carney, former chair of the Bank of England and of the FSB, has been pushing financial markets a lot to get banks and investors and corporations to take commitments to reduce their emissions to what we call net zero. So it's take them down as far as you can, and for the things that you really can't abate, you're allowed to buy offsets or to make up for those emissions otherwise. But and there's been a big take up in the market, dozens of the largest banks and investors on the market, tons of corporations, including Moody's as a corporation, our employer, committing to reduce emissions to zero, essentially, by 2040, 2050, depending on who you talk to. So that's really impressive. And that has given me hope in a way that I hadn't had in a long time, to be frank. But what I still find concerning is I'm not sure we're seeing the same level of commitments from governments to really reorient their policy and economic systems, including subsidies and all the other things that governments can do to reduce emissions. So there's still a lot of politics and a lot of protecting economic interests, short-term economic interests over long-term welfare of the world.
Okay. So is that really a big deal, though, going back to financial institutions going to net zero? I mean, it's not like financial institutions produce a lot of CO2. So, I mean, I know for each company, it takes effort and energy, and you have to be focused on accomplishing that. So I'm not diminishing that accomplishment, but in the grand scheme of things, that can't be that important, really, is it?
Well, that's a great question. So that's what's interesting about those commitments is this isn't about whether a bank is going to be able to change their light bulbs and buy only renewable electricity, because I'm with you. I don't care. I mean, I care a little bit, but no, that's not where the stakes are. It's about whether their portfolios are aligned with the Paris commitments, with those net zero targets. And so what this means is that every bank and every investor becomes the COP. They are chasing their clients, their lenders, their investee corporations to help them or incentivize them or scare them into actually taking and delivering on those net zero targets.
So are you saying, just so I make sure I have this right, you're saying that I'm a bank, I'm lending to all these different companies and households, and I'm looking at their carbon footprint, and I'm changing my pricing and my underwriting decisions so that my lending to these institutions will result in net zero. If I look at my portfolio, that it's driving the carbon emissions to net zero for that portfolio. Is that what you're saying?
That is exactly right. And we're not completely there yet in terms of banks changing their pricing policy, or where we're starting to see those signals where banks or investors might just pass on a real estate deal, for example, where they feel that the building is so carbon intensive, there's no way it's going to get net zero, and they're really trying to focus their assets on doing that transition. And so there's the sort of an easy and not so great approach, which is ditching everything that's carbon intensive, And that's not great because not everyone on the market thinks about net zero and carbon emissions. So that just means you're going to have a two-tiered market with a number of institutions holding all the dirty business, and then the global institutions looking good holding only green and clean businesses. The better approach is for them to work with their clients and help them, including with financing, help them transition and reduce their emissions.
That's an interesting idea. It just doesn't feel like it's going to work, right? Because financial institutions are motivated, like all businesses, by returns, and they're going to lend to where they get the highest returns, their own returns for their own balance sheet. So what's the mechanism, the incentive, the economic rationale for them to actually do this, other than getting browbeaten by Carney or some other government agency?
Yeah, so peer pressure, regulation, customer expectations, not to be understated. Survival of the species comes to mind as one of the drivers, and I know it doesn't usually factor in economic decisions. But we've actually come to the point where some of the largest banks are making it a policy, because they will tell you, what's the point of climate stress testing my portfolio for a 4-degree world? We just won't function. Right? So it's also a way to manage their own risk, because right now it's a voluntary commitment that they're taking, but there is an expectation that at some point, probably too late and therefore probably too fast, governments will take action, and then it will become required. And if they have to do it fast, it's going to be really brutal and impact and create a lot of stress on the economy.
Interesting. So you're saying they're going to prepare for the possibility that they're required by their own regulators or central banks to price for CO2, the carbon footprint of their clients, of their customers, of their borrowers. And if they're not preparing for that now, then they will get wrong-footed. They'll have a problem, down the road.
Right. And also, if you believe that we need to address climate change, then at some point we need to transition away from fossil fuel. And for those who haven't, they're going to be left holding the bag.
But Emilie,
so there's self-interest there.
Yeah, but you told your statistic was 7%. That 7% of global GDP goes to subsidizing fossil fuels, and that has not changed appreciably. That's why in the world do we think that governments are then going to turn around and tell their banking and financial institutions you got to price for the CO2 emissions, for carbon footprints? I mean, does that sound realistic? Do you think do you buy into that? Do you really think that's going to happen?
But that's why I have mixed feelings. I mean, again, we go back to survival of the species, right? We got to do something, and yeah, it's going to cost money. But the stakes are so big that it is actually worth it. Do I believe that the governments that are in the room right now making decisions that they have to deal with and implement are going to do everything that needs to be done? That's, we're humans and fallible, and no, they might not get to it. And then to your earlier question, is this going to turn into a giant greenwashing party where everybody says they're going to make those commitments, and they're like, yeah, we'll worry about it in 2049 for the 2050 target? So, this is where my job comes in as a provider of data, market intelligence, and so trying to provide transparency, trying to help with accountability with banks, investors, governments, understand what companies are doing. But at the end of the day, everybody needs to do their piece. And it goes against short-term economic self-interest. So that's the challenge.
I'm an economist, right? I have a hard time getting my mind that that's going to work. I mean, I hear you. But let me ask you this. Why, if we're going to, as an economist, feels like to me the most straightforward way to address climate change is just price carbon. Just, you did cap and trade, but why not just a carbon tax? I mean, that's kind of easy, right? That's really easy to implement. We know how to do it. It generates a boatload of revenue. It's going to affect, CO2 emissions. We could take that revenue, give it back to individuals, particularly low-income households, because I understand it will be regressive kind of tax. I mean, low-income households will suffer more because they consume more of their more of their consumption goes to energy intensive kinds of spending. But why, if we're going to expend all this political energy on something like getting the financial institutions to price for CO2 emissions, why wouldn't we just go to the most obvious thing and pass carbon taxes?
I am entirely with you. Spent
Are
5 years
you?
of my life writing reports about the intricacies of the politics and the market dynamics of cap and trade. And yes, please give me a tax. It's so much easier. The politics are not so good in the US. So cap and trade was, in economic terms, it's supposed to be even better than a tax because then you have the perfect marginal cost of reducing emissions and the market sorts itself out and you get Brazil to stop burning the forest and that allows others to continue doing certain things. In practice, it's a mess and we still didn't get it through Congress. So back to square one, can we please have a tax?
Well, let me ask you a question. I know Canada, there's examples around the world, but Canada is the one that comes to my mind. They have a carbon tax, right? And how is that? Do you have any sense of how that's working? If that's been any successful in getting CO2 emissions down? Or do I have that wrong?
Last I checked, there was sort of a carbon tax in Alberta. The Canadian government strikes me as, like Australia, like the US, one of those countries that's been just flip-flopping from one election to the next. Yes, we're serious about climate change. No, we really don't believe in it, don't care. Let's pour more subsidies into oil and gas. So would you see any discernible effects? Not necessarily. The problem with cap and trade is that governments meddle with the rules so much that the price stays very low, and so that defeats the purpose.
Let me ask you another question. This is more parochial because we're in economics. We produce lots of scenarios, lots of forecasts, and one of the things that we're trying to do is define the climate risk assumptions that go into our baseline worldview. So we say here's what we think the economy is going to do across all the different countries of the world, different regions of the world. We have all kinds of assumptions around monetary policy, fiscal policy, the pandemic. Obviously, Cris does a lot of work trying to understand the epidemiology of the pandemic and what that means. Vaccines. So we got a lot of assumptions, but so far, historically, we've had implicitly climate risk assumptions, but not explicit ones. So we are making it clear what are the underlying climate risk assumptions that we're using in our worldview, in our forecasts. And one of the key assumptions that we've been debating is around where, and again, this is the baseline. So this is the most likely scenario. And there's a distribution of possible outcomes pretty wide here, but in the middle of the distribution, what is the temperature rise going to be? And as you pointed out, under the Paris Accord back, I guess it was 6 years ago, there was a commitment to get to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if we did that, then we kind of dodged the most significant bullets here around climate risk. Right now, our thinking is, well, 1.5 seems like not a baseline kind of forecast. So we're thinking somewhere between 2 to 2.5 degrees Celsius increase, which, we're going to, if that's the case, we're going to see some significant problems related to climate risk. What do you have a view on that? I mean, can you help us out here? What do you think? If you were in our shoes thinking about this, and by the way, this is important for our forecast because to get to whatever degree, because this affects, property loss and chronic physical risk and, affects a lot of different things that are key to the economic outlook. And productivity, so forth and so on. What if you were in our shoes? How would you think about this? What would your assumption be?
Yeah, so I have a view and I have data too.
Oh, great.
So
okay, that's perfect.
I believe right now we're on track, business as usual, at best, towards 2.7, which is really high. And even that is the median, because when you look at the full range, we don't know exactly, right? So we're still learning the science of how greenhouse gas drive different impacts around the world and how quickly we are warming. We're actually warming than we thought because we're melting the ice sheet, where there's all kind of things that are reinforcing the warming. So 2.7, 3.1, that's the business as usual baseline that probably should be factoring in. And that comes with a lot of impacts in terms of physical risk. Some of those are easier to model than others, right? So you're looking at, and I know your teams do that very well, but looking at impacts on real estate prices from sea level rise, looking at impacts on productivity and agricultural output from chronic change in temperature. And some of these other impacts are harder to forecast because when you look at extreme weather events, we know that we're going to get more hurricanes and that we know we're going to get hurricanes that are more intense, not necessarily more of them. We don't know when, we don't know where they're going to hit, we don't know how big they're going to are. So that's harder to forecast. And then there's all the secondary impacts that we're not even looking at right now in terms of water stress. How is that going to affect the California and the Texas economy? Is California going to continue to produce as much agricultural products? What does that mean for local real estate markets when all the water dries off and we stop producing food and ag and beverage, also a big industry? Data centers need a lot of water. What happens when you get more migration?
Crypto producers, right? They need a lot of electricity, right? Cris knows this. Cris is a very avid crypto miner and trader.
Only green crypto, though. Only green.
His carbon footprint is really, Emilie.
Tiny.
You want to get the world's carbon footprint down. You got to focus on Cris. Just focus on him.
You'll get a call from me on Monday, Cris. No, but you get the picture, right? Business as usual looks bad in terms of.
Well, when you say business
risk.
as usual, that means no change in policy, no change in technology. Is that business as usual for you?
Yeah, that means continuing what we do the way we do it, pretty much.
Okay.
And then you add the scenarios where we actually get our act together soon, or we get our act together late. And when it's late, then we need to do a lot more faster. And that's where all hell breaks loose in terms of the impacts, the economic impacts. So there is an economic benefit to making those decisions, even if they have those short-term costs on carbon, because you're avoiding a lot of impacts and economic costs long-term. And that goes back to what Mark Carney coined that expression, the tragedy of the horizon, right? We know climate change is coming, but it's out of the economic and financial horizon. And therefore, it's easier to make decisions today that make money, and even if they don't address the long-term issue.
Yeah. Okay. So, but your baseline for assumption can't be 2.7 to 3.1 degrees Celsius, because you've got to be assuming, I think, some policy response, some technological advance. I mean, people are focused on how do I mitigate CO2 in the environment, and there's all kinds of new technologies that are being worked on, and got to assume that something is going to have some impact here. So if you were us, would you settle on 2.7, 3.1, or would something lower than that?
2.7 is reasonable given what we see. If you want to be a little more optimistic and you look at all the net zero commitments that have been taken recently, I think we're at 1.9 or 1.8. So that's a lot better. That's still a lot of physical impacts, but certainly gets us closer to the 1.5 target. Okay.
Cris, what is your sense of this, Cris Dorides? I mean, because I know you've been thinking about this in terms of the underlying assumptions. Have you come to any kind of view on this issue?
Well, my view is that it's complicated. Certainly, a lot of numbers get thrown around, and even there's a lot that forecast of what happens under current policies. There's quite a range, right? 2.7, there's 3.1, 3.2. We've been using the NGFS, that's the Network for Greening of the Financial System scenarios. These were published last June, basically doing a weighted average of those various forecasts. So under that set of scenarios, the no policy action is actually assuming 3.2% or 3.2 degrees Celsius increase by the end of 2100. And the other scenarios basically get you to 1.7, 1.8, right? So the way I've been thinking of it, I kind of flip the coin and say either we're going to go down the path of no change, right? Or we're going to do something, some mix of policy and technology. I don't know what that mix looks like. So I settled on 50-50 between, we don't do anything and we do something. And that gets you to 2.5 degrees Celsius. So that's how I've been thinking about it, but it's a very naive type of view.
Yeah. Hey, Emilie, so we're working on this right now. Would you mind if we kind of connect with you on this and just get your perspective once we nail
Yeah, no,
nail
of
this
course.
down? You should see the email chain between Cris, I, and Gaurav Ganguly, who's our economist in Europe, and Chris Lefakis and Mike Brisson. It's like I can't keep track of the email debate about
Yeah,
this.
no, please, happy to
Yeah.
happy to
Okay.
join in.
Very good. Hey, couple quick questions, kind of lightning round, because I know we're running out of time. On 427, now I'm part of Moody's. So 427, the name has been retired, part of Moody's, but you're still doing the same kind of scoring of different types of physical risks. Everything from flooding to sea level rise to whatever, tornadoes. Also other non-climate related, right? Like earthquakes and that kind of thing, I believe. Of all the different risks that you're scoring, which is the hardest to score, to get a grip on?
Oh, that's a great
given
question. Yeah. So I thought you were going to ask what's the most important one.
Well,
and
okay, that's
so
a good, that's even
but
better
they're
question.
they're
Yeah,
kind
yeah,
of related, right?
yeah.
So wet risk, as our friends at RMS calls them, floods, sea level rise, so fluvial, pluvial, coastal floods, so floods from rivers spilling out, floods from too much rain, floods from the oceans rising, and storm surges in particular during hurricanes. It's the biggest risk. It's also where you need the most sophistication in really digging deep to understand the dynamics of how water is going to move and when and how long it's going to stay. And that's also where we have the greatest exposure globally. I mentioned earlier, right, 30% of the population globally has exposure to flood. You've got entire regions in Asia Pacific. You've got the East Coast in the US that's super exposed. And also a lot of uncertainty because sea level rise is happening faster than we'd like in many ways. And it's also one of those risks where even if we even if we go to 1.5, 1.8, there's a number of processes that are in play that we may not be able to stop. And so sea level rise, we might just need to live with, and that's going to redefine the coastlines over many decades and centuries, but it's really going to change the maps and where we live, where humanity lives on the planet.
Right. Well, one last question. Build Back Better. This is the piece of legislation that's in Congress now being debated, and it includes a sizable amount of money for different climate risk related policies. Everything from more subsidy for electric vehicles to solar panels and a bunch of different stuff. What do you think? What's your sense of that? Any perspective on the Build Back Better? I mean, is it something, if you were a senator in the U.S. Congress, would you vote for it?
Well, that's an easy one. Yes, I'm
yes,
big on investment in infrastructure. One of the most interesting things that I've seen in that bill is the $47 billion going to resilience and adaptation investments. So this is not about EVs or reducing emissions. This is really about preparing ourselves for the impacts, again, sea level rise and storms and wildfires that we're seeing already across the US. And then I think a lot of there's a lot more in the spending bill that's going to come in terms of carbon emissions. So we need to see what happens with that one.
Hey, Cris and Ryan, any questions for Emilie while you have her? I mean, anything that I missed that you're dying to ask? Any pushback? Is there anything she said?
I was hoping she was going to end on a positive note.
Oh no!
We usually try to end on an upbeat note. Doesn't sound like
can we be upbeat, Emilie? Come on, give us try it, please. Give us a bone.
Sorry, that's not part of my job description. No, I think we can do it. We've got you said it earlier, Mark, right? There's commitment from the market. There's technology. We can't just rely on a silver bullet, but there is technology improvements. Okay, good news. We can make water out of thin air. Isn't that a cool, a cool
That is
technology?
cool.
You
I didn't
can
know
have
that.
water panels, like solar panels, and you get the humidity and you create water in the middle of the desert.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, that was kind of thin, but okay, we'll go with it. Yeah. Hey, but I tend to be optimistic about this kind of thing because I've seen big problems. As you can tell, I've been around a while, and we've had our share of problems leading up to climate risk. And when push comes to shove, we somehow, some way, I can't quite figure it out. We come together and we solve the problem. And I suspect that's going to be the case here. That we don't know what technological changes are dead ahead of us, but the technology tends to bail us out, particularly when we put our mind to it. So I'm, I think it's prudent to be cautious and think about the downside because that gets you moving on trying to solve these problems. But at the end of the day, I think we're going to figure out a way around this. I wish we would tax carbon though, because if we did that and really light a fire under people to, figure out
It
new
would make
technologies.
alternative technology a lot more attractive.
Yeah,
So yeah, let's
exactly.
invest in technologies.
Yes, let's do it.
We can do
Okay.
this.
Well, thank. I'm sorry, Ryan. Did you? Was there anything you wanted to ask, Emily? No. Okay.
No, I was
Cris,
just
anything I
asking for
missed?
something positive.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yep. Emily, Cris, anything you wanted to ask Emily?
Well, just on the last note, my
Yeah.
question was, are we better off actually investing in technology, putting those dollars that we're pledging to research
Interesting
and
question.
all sorts
Yeah.
of pledges around carbon targets? Is society better off just taking that and plowing it into more research and development, right? Are we trying to work with current solutions that maybe are far less efficient than something new?
I think usually there's a mix of both. And I don't think it's an either or, right? We need to use what we have because we need reductions now, and we need to invest because we need to do more in the future. So there's both.
Very diplomatic, thank you.
Yeah, very nicely done. Very nicely
No,
done.
I need it. I'm not trying to
Very
make
nicely
people
done.
happy.
That was a very Doritos response.
That's why I liked it.
very-
I like
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Well, you guys might have noticed I didn't advertise my Twitter handle this time, but I'm going to do it now. At Mark Zandi. I'm on Twitter. Emily, are you on Twitter?
Yes, at Emilie Mazzacurati.
I am definitely going to follow you. I need to follow you, so I'm going to do. And but only if you follow me, Emily.
Of
Promise,
course, Mark. You're my first. You're my next
Okay.
hit on Twitter.
That's so funny. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us. It was a really a very informative conversation. A little depressing, but that's the nature of the beast here. So, but thank you again. And with that, we're going to call this a podcast. See you next week.